This Geography Burst will cover the Chile earthquake of 2010 and the Nepal earthquake of 2015. You should use page 14 to 17 of your textbook to support this video. We'll be looking at the causes of both earthquakes, the effects, both primary and secondary, and also the responses to each of those disasters, both in the immediate and long term. So firstly, the causes of the Chile earthquake of 2010, which registered 8.8 on the Richter scale. It was caused by a destructive plate boundary. Chile is located where the Nazca Plate, which is oceanic crust, is subducting beneath the South American Plate, which is continental crust. The Nepal earthquake, on the other hand, of 2015, registered 7.9 on the Richter scale and sits on a collision plate boundary. This is where the Eurasian Plate and Indo-Australian Plate, which are both continental crust, so similar in terms of their density and thickness, are colliding head-on, forcing up the Himalaya mountain range and also creating earthquakes. So now we will describe the effects and responses, which means say what you see, what are the key facts which you know, outline them clearly. So, a primary effect is something that is a direct result of a natural disaster. So, for instance, in an earthquake, that would be buildings collapsing. In Chile, the primary effects, 500 people lost their lives, 12,000 were injured, and a huge 800,000 people were left homeless by the earthquake. The Talcahuano port and Santiago airport were both severely damaged. Most of the entire country lost its power and water supply due to damaged mains, and the cost was valued at approximately $30 billion. A secondary effect is something that is an effect of a primary effect, so a sort of knock-on effect. So one example would be fires would break out as a result of gas leaks or electricity wires being damaged by the initial quake. The secondary effects in Chile were a large fire broke out at a chemical plant near Santiago, the capital. A tsunami was triggered that damaged coastal towns not just in Chile but across the Pacific Ocean basin. And landslides damaged 1,500 kilometers of roads and cut off some of the more remote villages, making the aid to get in there take a lot longer than normal. So the primary effects for the Nepal earthquake were 9,000 deaths, 20,000 people injured, and 3 million people homeless. As well as this, 7,000 schools were destroyed, the hospitals in the region were completely overwhelmed, 1.4 million people were in need of food, water and shelter. The cost of the damage, $5 billion. The secondary effects of the earthquake were avalanches created across the Himalayas, even on Mount Everest, where at least 19 people lost their lives. Landslides also blocked roads, which meant the aid into the area was hampered. And the Kali Gandaki River was blocked by landslides, and people living in those areas, even though they weren't affected by the earthquake, were evacuated because there was a fear that they could be flooded. So during a natural disaster, there are two types of responses. Firstly, there are immediate responses. These aim to save people's lives and protect any of the injured people who have survived the disaster. So they would include things like providing emergency water, food, medical supplies and hospitals, as well as shelter and clothes for the survivors. Long-term responses aim to restore normality and strengthen the affected area, so it would include education of the people and building things like earthquake-proof buildings so that if a future disaster was to strike, the area would be better equipped to deal with the problem. The responses to the Chile earthquake immediate responses were power and water was restored to 90% of the households that were affected by the earthquake within 10 days. Temporary repairs to one of the main roads, Highway 5, that runs through the country, were carried out within 24 hours. And a national appeal across Chile raised over $30 million to help build shelters for those made homeless. The long-term responses were that nearly 200,000 households were helped by a reconstruction program that was launched by the Chilean government within 1 month of the disaster. As Chile is what we would class as a HIC, they didn't really need to source any funds from overseas. They were able to contain the disaster and respond to it within their own means. The responses to Nepal's earthquake, immediate responses, were the UK, India and China were among some of the countries to send search and aid rescue teams, water and food and medical aid. Over 500,000 tents were needed to help those who were made homeless, and helicopters were needed for rescue and supplying aid to some of the isolated settlements that were cut off by landslides. In the long-term responses, repairs were made to Everest Base Camp to boost tourism in the area and new trekking pathways were created. There was a much stricter control on building codes so that if a future earthquake was to strike the area, they would stand more of a chance of not collapsing. And roads repaired and landslides cleared, and any blockages to rivers cleared to avoid the threat of flooding. Finally, we will see an example, an exam question and waggle. So we must evaluate, which means to give an intelligent opinion. What are the patterns behind the facts? Group ideas and weigh them up carefully. So here is our example exam question. Evaluate the effectiveness of the immediate and long-term responses to a tectonic hazard in two countries of contrasting levels of wealth. 9 marks. So we follow the structure. Firstly, we describe. Immediate responses are when people react straight away in order to save people's lives and protect those affected. Long-term responses happen over a period of weeks or months or years and help the area affected to recover and strengthen their defences. So next we explain. So in this case we'll explain the immediate and long-term responses to Chile's earthquake. Firstly, in a HIC, Chile's earthquake of 2010 had many immediate responses, such as getting Route 5 repaired and 90% of the household's energy supplies restored within 10 days. They also have very effective long-term responses and so created a reconstruction program which helped 200,000 households just 1 month after the disaster. So next we explain the opposite, in this case Nepal's immediate and long-term responses. Secondly, in an LIC, Nepal's earthquake of 2015 also had immediate responses, including sending 500,000 tents, as well as search and rescue teams to Mount Everest to help anyone who was trapped in landslides or avalanches. The long-term responses were not as helpful, as they do not have the money to pay for rebuilding and repairing schools and businesses. Many people were still living in the tents provided by aid. They did rebuild Everest Base Camp and invite tourists back to make a living, but needed international help to support financially. And finally, to round off the question, we evaluate, which is of course the command word. Nepal was worse affected and had limited availability of emergency services and were unable to rebuild due to money constraints, as they are an LIC, whereas Chile was able to plan and prepare emergency services and financially set up the long-term rebuild of their country, as they are a HIC and wealthy. If Nepal have more wealth, they could have improved their responses too. Therefore, LICs have less effective responses as a direct result of limited money. Geography. Know your world.